Hello, I'm Tracy Larkin. They call me Foot out here on King Hill, and that's where I am on King Hill, sitting on the front porch or on the front steps of my grandfather's house. Uh, there are a lot of memories in this house. My four sisters were raised here. Funeral services for my mother, my grandmother, and many of our other family members emanated from this house back in the day when the funeral home would bring the body out to the house the day before the funeral or the day of the funeral, and the body would lay in state in the house. My mother lay in state in this house. My grandfather, Papa, that was his favorite seat right over there. He sat there every day. That is when he had taken care of all of his chores, the mule, Joe in the back, um, the shrubbery. That was his profession, you know. He was a landscape artist. My grandmother would sit here with him and on this other side of the porch. My Aunt Rachel, who was my grandfather's aunt, so our great great aunt, she sat on the porch. She was blind, but they sat here all day and they spoke to neighbors who came up and down the street here on King Hill. And King Hill was a wonderful place and still is. And the reason I chose this opportunity to ask you for your continued support in my continuing to work for you on the Montgomery City Council, I wanted to sit on my grandfather's porch and talk about the way things used to be and the way things can be still again. And as we are working right now actively with a revitalization program here on King Hill to restore this once wonderful community. And I sit on the steps of this house because it represents one of the major initiatives that I've tried to promote continually on the Montgomery City Council, and that is neighborhood revitalization. The problem with abandoned or vacant residential properties in our city, vacant commercial properties in our city. I've introduced several times before the Montgomery City Council a vacant and abandoned buildings ordinance, which sadly has not passed yet, but I can assure you that with our continued work with the City Council and my continued tenure on the City Council, we will get that ordinance passed. But this house, my grandfather's house, falls right into the category of one of the houses that I would have passed a law to say that you've got to do something with that house. Nothing has been done with my grandfather's house. It is what we call in our community air property. It is one of the problems that we have in the African American communities today. This problem with air property, where there are multiple owners of the property, multiple heirs to the property, and the family is not willing or ready to come together to pool their resources to do something about granddaddy's property, grandma's property, great-grandma's house. And so it just sits. And so this house is sat as the passing of my mother's final sibling a few years ago who lived here. When she passed, the house has been vacant since then. And so it represents a part of the issue of the blight problem that we talk about frequently on the Montgomery City Council. And that's one of the major initiatives that I have tried to work on since I have been a member of the Montgomery City Council. We have passed a resolution for a neighborhood revitalization program. We have put forth resolutions for an environmental court in Montgomery, Alabama, to clean up our communities and to make people accountable in the municipal court when they don't keep their properties clean and they throw trash and debris on our streets. We've also worked to advocate for a rental property ordinance so that people can be assured that whenever they rent a property in Montgomery, Alabama, it's a property that's decent and habitable and worth living in. And we have also advocated for a neighborhood services department, a department that wakes up every day with the only focus of that department being working for the citizens of Montgomery, Alabama, so that a citizen could call 311, but a citizen can also pick up the phone and call the neighborhood services department and talk to a service representative whose job it is to focus like a laser beam on the issue that you have in your community, whether it's a street light that's not burning, whether it's a broken sidewalk or potholes in the paved streets, whether it's nuisance with barking dogs or vicious dogs in the neighborhood, whatever it is, the neighborhood service representative would be qualified, and we would be a voice that would be listening to you to address your problems directly. And that is something that we've advocated for, and that is something that the city has decided that we will do. We now have a neighborhood services department whose responsibility it will be to respond directly to citizens' complaints. Rental license registration. We have been working diligently to get something done with that, and now we have, with the beginning of the new calendar year, we will have a rental license program so that people who are renting properties will be accountable to the city of Montgomery as to the condition of the property, whether or not it meets housing standards, whether or not you have problematic neighbors that are keeping disturbances and becoming a public nuisance. All of those things will be regulated once the rental registration law goes into effect in January of 2020. The other thing that we've worked really hard for is a strengthening of our litter law. And we are actively, as we speak, working on the litter law before the Montgomery City Council. As a child growing up here on King Hill, we didn't have the paved streets that we have today. We didn't have the sidewalks that you see here today. We didn't have indoor plumbing. We had outdoor toilet facilities. And every individual had to walk a half block away from their homes to use a common hydrant in order to gather water to cook with, to wash with, to bathe in. Any need for water had to be transported from a common point in the community, in the neighborhood. That's the kind of neighborhood that we grew up in. Not luxurious, not one that did not require you to go outside to the bathroom at midnight if necessary. Not one that had paved roads. The roads had to be scraped and oiled from time to time to keep the dust down. But in my King Hill, we kept our yards clean. There was no litter in the neighborhood. If you can imagine in the 50s and 60s, when there were no paved streets, there was no indoor plumbing, there were no amenities in the neighborhood, but every citizen in the neighborhood felt compelled to sweep their yard every day. We kept our yards clean. We kept our neighborhood clean. We kept our communities clean. But over time, we've lost that. Somewhere along the way, we have become accepting of dirty neighborhoods. We've become accepting of overgrown lots and yards. We've become accepting of trash and debris on our front porches, on the side of our houses, in the back of our houses. We have become insensitive to, or desensitized to, this issue of dirty neighborhoods and the environment and how it affects us psychologically, how it affects the looks of the place aesthetically, how it affects the health issues of the place environmentally. We have become so accepting of dirt and filth in this day and time. And so we think it's necessary for us to put a renewed focus on where do we go from here with litter management. What kind of city do we want for our children? Do we want dirty streets? Do we want some of the sites that you see in many of the larger urban areas of this country? That has never been the case in Montgomery, Alabama. So even with those conditions on King Hill as a child, we still had pride in our community. We loved where we lived. And it didn't matter that we were poor, because we didn't really understand that we were as poor as we were, because the surroundings were so rich. And so we want to restore that dignity to communities like King Hill, like Newtown, like Boylston, like Chisholm, like every neighborhood in Montgomery that's crying out for support from the city. And that's why these initiatives are so important, because many people felt that the city had forgotten about the neighborhoods. and many of the services that neighborhoods were previously accustomed to were not being done as effectively anymore. But we're moving in a direction that it will bring those services back. We're moving in a direction that will make Montgomery a more quality place to live. As we are great people, as we are the people who spawned the modern history of the civil rights world, we are people who have shown great courage. We are people that have shown great fortitude, great self-discipline. We are a great people, and our city is on the verge of greatness. We are at a crossroads in our city, and that's why it's so important to keep continuity in the city government and keep the city moving along at the pace of growth that it is now growing as a new mayor comes into office. And so I ask you to give me the opportunity to continue to serve you as the same little boy from King Hill, who my childhood friends all still call Foot, the person who never would have believed that I would have grown up to represent the home community where I was born and raised, the schools where I matriculated, William Burns Patterson, Booker T. Washington Jr. and Booker T. Washington Senior High Schools in the city, also within the 3rd District that I represent. As Montgomery is at a real crossroads in its history now, just as it was at the beginning of the Civil War, just as it was with the beginning of the modern civil rights movement when Martin Luther King achieved stardom here in this city. The city is now at another crossroads. We're about to transition into another phase of the city's life. And it's extremely important that those of us who have the right and the privilege to vote exercise that right and that privilege to vote. It was very, very disappointing on August the 27th in this recent election that only 31% of the eligible registered voters in Montgomery, Alabama, bothered to get up and go to the polls to vote. So our question is not with the 31% that felt the need for the exercise of citizenship to go to the polls, to exercise that right to vote and to participate in this representative democracy. Our issue is with that 69%. It didn't bother one way or the other to go to the polls to spend 5 minutes to exercise the right to vote, which was born right here on this hallowed ground in this city. The Selma to Montgomery March is what brought about the voting rights law, which gave tens of thousands of African Americans in rural Alabama cities and towns the right to vote for the first time unfettered, without having to pass literacy tests and to pay toll taxes and all those things that were once required. So it's really sort of it's disrespectful to the memories of Dr. King and Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin and all of the soldiers of the civil rights movement and the voting rights movement. Viola Luzzo, who lost her life on an Alabama highway from Detroit, Michigan, here, marching for the right of freedom and the right to vote for African Americans in this state and in the Deep South. And for us to not want to exercise that right is just disrespectful. And we should not want to be known as the most apathetic city in the country when it comes to participating in our city elections. So this coming Tuesday, October the 8th, remember, you have a responsibility to exercise that right, to take just a few moments and to find your polling place and to cast a vote in this election coming up on October the 8th at this critical time in Montgomery's history, so that we can save King Hill and we can save every other neighborhood in Montgomery like King Hill. I'm Tracy Larkin, and I ask for your continued support. Thank you very much.